the additional hour, we'll be able to at least listen to what everybody had to say. So let me start just by saying my name is Russell Valentino. I'm a faculty member at Indiana University and one of the co-project investigators with a grant from a partnership grant from the U.S. Embassy, the Office of Public Affairs, Division of Public Affairs in Kyiv, Ukraine. And we partnered with the National University of Kiev Mohyla Academy 2.5 years ago, approximately, in this project to improve the training prospects for strategic communications professionals, particularly with the government communications focus. And the idea was to develop some degree programs, formal degree programs at Kiev Mohyla for students at the master's degree level, usually master's public affairs students. Um, so a track in their existing MPA program, and then also a program for professionals who are already in the workforce, or for doctoral students, let's say, in different fields who might want to improve their skills and acquire some additional knowledge with regard to strategic or government communications. That's an in-service program. And both of those have launched and they've got a lot of students. So we're really, really pleased with that. Um, and then there'll be two more degrees that'll come out at the undergraduate level, a general certificate that any major might combine. So you have a sociology major or a English major and you want to combine that with a government communications, um, some coursework, you can do that. And then a bachelor's degree. And the bachelor's degree will be a new addition for Kiev Mohyla. As part of putting all of this together, we did a needs assessment. And we partnered with our colleagues at Kiev Mohyla. They went out and looked to see what was available in Ukraine in general. So making lists of programs and what kinds of degrees were available. And then we went, four of us went from Bloomington to Kiev. This was in spring of 2019. And with our partners from Kiev Mohyla and the US Embassy, we visited a number of ministries and talked with the ministers and their staffs about what skills they might want. What would they, if graduates came to them, what would they want? What would they want them to be able to do? Um, and so we were very focused on Ukraine, and we never really stopped to ask the question, well, what do they do everywhere else in the world? How does training happen in the United States? How does training happen in Europe? We didn't really ask that question because we were focused on creating new degree programs in Ukraine. And so the question came up, and it became clear that we just didn't know the answer to that. It seems to be a very wide field with a lot of different ways of getting into it. And so that is the origin, that was the background for these two panels that we are holding. This one today, more focused on practice and professional work. And next week, at the same time, and we'll get the time right next week, um, on somewhat more a broader focus, maybe more training and democratic values and uh, 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 philosophy of governance. So, and there'll be some overlap, right? Because some of the people have more practical experience and some have more theoretical or teaching experience. So that's the origin of this panel and next week's panel. And I'm very, very grateful that the four of you could join us today. I'm just going to introduce you briefly, and then I'm going to indicate that your bios will be available via links. I think we'll send them out here. I can't remember how we're going to do that, Mackenzie. Remind me. But here, let me just say that our panelists today, our official partner, obviously, this is Indiana University, Bloomington, and then the Andrei Mileshevich Kiev Mohyla School of Governance. And Andrei unfortunately passed away last year. He was a staunch supporter of this program, and it was very much involved in the planning and implementation of it. And so we miss his participation greatly. With us as panelists today are, I'm going to introduce you in the order that I have them on my um, on my sheet here, which is not alphabetical, unfortunately. Doug Wasitis, who is Associate Vice President for Federal Relations at Indiana University. And then Lana Spendel, who is a speechwriter and communication specialist in the Office of the Provost at Indiana University. And then Professor Yaroslav Dvorak at Klaipėda University in Lithuania, and Dr. Yeva Berzina, who is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Society and Science at Vidzeme University of Applied Sciences in Latvia. And I want to start off our conversation by asking, the format we're going to use is I'm going to ask a couple of very general questions. I think I gave you some prompts beforehand so that you could see basically what I was interested in talking about. Um, and then you'll be able to answer as long as you need to answer. Then we'll keep an eye on the time, and I would like to enable people in the audience to ask some. So ask some questions. And I got a handful, maybe a half dozen, sent to us beforehand. So we already have some sense of what they might like to know. So let's start off with this very general question about you. And how you got into this specialization. Um, so your training, subjects you studied, things that you thought were especially helpful in developing the skills that you use the most, let's say. And if you were starting out today, uh, what you might do differently, what additional skills you might explore, or training, or knowledge base that you might explore today if you were beginning today. And then a kind of related question to that: if you were hiring somebody, if you're, let's say you're in a position to hire someone in an entry level position, uh, today or next week, what sort of skills would you be looking for? And how would you expect people to gain those skills? So I don't know what the best order to follow is. We could do this alphabetically. If we do it alphabetically, that means you would go first, Yeva, and then we would go to, let me see, Yaroslav, and then Lana and Doug. You would be last. Does that sound okay with everybody? So that sounds okay. Okay, great. So Yeva, please take it away.
All right, if you say so, thank you, Russell. And first of all, it's really my pleasure to be here. This is seems to be a very interesting project, and also I'm learning by listening what you say about this. But so as we start in the first round, so we need to introduce with our background, as if I understood correctly. Yeah. So firstly, what I'm currently I'm affiliated with two academic institutions. One is Vidzeme University of Applied Sciences, where I am associated professor already. But my second affiliation is National Defense Academy, and the link you provided is actually from the academy, where I am a senior researcher. And what I'm doing, so I'm for more than 10 years already, I'm mainly in academia, I'm researcher and professor. So I don't need to hire people with certain communication background. Nevertheless, my approach is rather interdisciplinary because, to be honest, I have no formal education in communication at all, but I have a 10-year practical experience. Before I started academic career, I was working as marketing manager in communication area, and largely what I have learned was rather from practice and my own interest. My educational background is political science. At the bachelor's level, I have completed the Master of Business Administration. And then my last 5 years in professional career, I worked as a marketing manager for, I was actually head of the department in Turiba University, and being in the academic environment, it stimulated me to turn to doctoral studies. And then I thought I could do, then my idea was how can I integrate political science with marketing and communication? And so I did my PhD in political science, but I did it in rather interdisciplinary field, the political marketing, where politics and marketing largely overlaps. And I think I found it was challenging, nevertheless, very interesting. And I did my PhD thesis on political campaigning. Particularly, what I was looking for was global political campaigning, and I was looking how Western and post-Soviet political campaigning techniques, how they were applied in the context of Latvia. And I will not take much time. I will stop here with just mentioning that while I was writing my thesis, I also paid attention to the topic of color revolutions, particularly Ukrainian Orange Revolution, and the way how political communication, how communication tools were used in these political struggles, not only internally, but also on a geopolitical scale. And this also led me, turned my interests towards information warfare and also strategic communication. And then when our research center in National Defense Academy were developed or reorganized in 2013, so they were looking for somebody with an interest and potential in researching strategic communication, and so I gladly joined this position. And also this aspect I'm also developing in Vidzeme University of Applied Sciences, where I teach a course on democracy and security, and how this is being related. And of course, communication is an integral part of all this. And the reason why I joined particularly this panel, because one of the projects that we did together with my colleagues from Vidzeme University was on COVID-19, and we investigated government communication effectiveness in the pandemic. So I think I will stop here, not to be too long with my experience, but later on I can share some of our findings if it seems relevant to you. So thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And it looks like Les Lenkovsky is joining us. I think I'll just say a brief word of introduction. Les, we're talking about the first question about background and skills and experience leading into your work in your professional work in communications. Let me just say who you are so people know. Joining us also is Les Lenkovsky, Professor Emeritus in Public Affairs and Philanthropy from Indiana University. And we are going to make the bios available. If you haven't got them already, I believe Larissa Trovniuk from Kiev Mohyla is sending out to the participants, to the audience, a document that has links to the full bios of everybody that were provided by the panelists. And let's move on to Yaroslav, please, about that first question about training.
Okay, thank you very much for invitation to join this interesting discussion and share with you some thoughts. I am Yaroslav Dvorak from Lithuania, from Klaipėda University. And today I am working as head of department of public administration and political sciences. And Actually, I also have very similar story, like Yeva mentioned it, probably maybe related with our post-communist countries, but I'm also actually I checked my diplomas as I also studied in the beginning in my bachelor in business administration. And after that, I just started to study master in public administration and finally PhD in political sciences. So what I found in my diplomas, which I checked when you asked to look, that we have not so many specific study in communication studies at that time. For sure, it's during our studies we studied at marketing courses some communication things, and I just found in my master diploma that I have special course which was titled like Theories of Communication. So later, when I worked on my PhD thesis, which was related with evaluation of public policies. So I have also very good training, as at that time, when I prepared PhD, I also were involved in and still continue to involved in many applied research or evaluation doing for public organizations. So I was recognized that it's very important to have be quite good in communication, especially with different public sector organizations, because you must to speak with different audience, different stakeholders, actors, and etc. And it's especially very important in order to reach decision making. Before all that, I also had an experience in a private company and also worked in sales and purchasing as head of department. And during that time, I also have, I was a big fan of communication inside of organization and outside of organization. And actually, it was also like some kind of my initiative that we must to communicate effectively inside of organization, because it's reduced number of our mistakes. Must be some persons who are responsible for some communication things inside of organization, and it's especially important also to communicate outside and to have a very good image for our customers and etc. So, and you also ask about if I will hire. For sure, I am as head of department. I am making different decision to hire, and we must have normally teachers or somebody researchers who are working in the department. But yeah, I think it's very important still who have ability to create effective communication. And from my point of view, it's first of all very good to have oral communication, so very good presentation skills. By the same time, it's very important for us that person will be able to write correctly and effectively, and also to write to have abilities to write very interesting, let's say, messages, either online by using social networks or just writing some emails. I think it's also good to have oral presentation, because if you are an expert, so you must to present your ideas or some opinions for audience through the media sources, because very often some of us are invited by some media channels to give expression. And also I think that it's very important that a person as from side of research field, that I will be happy to have some person who have ability to create effective visual communication, because I think it's very important. I think it's important for both government, private sector, non-profit sector to have such kind of specialists who can create some visual communication, visualization of research, of some ideas and everything. So I think at that moment I can stop. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's great. Let's stick to that original order, and Les, you can go last. I hope that's okay. Thank you again for joining us. Alana, you're
Sure,
next,
that's
and we're
fine.
great, thank you. And we're still talking about that first set of questions about training.
Thank you, Russell. I am originally from Bosnia. My family and I, we were refugees of the Bosnian War, and we lived briefly in Spain for 4 years before coming to the States. So my background is international, and I went to college in the States. I went to the University of Florida, and I received a BA in English. And there I discovered a love for creative writing. So I really wanted to do a master's program in creative writing, but I decided to take some time off, in which I worked as a banker for Bank of America, and I worked primarily with customers in Spanish as a banker. And I also, during that time in between college and grad school, worked as an interpreter for a program in Florida called Survivors of Torture. And this was for immigrants who had survived just terrible experiences in their countries. And I interpreted during therapy sessions, during doctor's appointments, during conferences. I would be with a client on stage as they were telling their story during conferences. So after that, I decided to come to grad school, and I came to Indiana University, and I completed an MFA in creative writing. So I am a fiction writer by trade. And while I was completing the MFA, I was also teaching creative writing and English composition, which is mainly, essay writing. And I was also serving as the nonfiction editor to Indiana Review, which is a national literary journal, which publishes short fiction, personal essays, and poetry. And after that, I received an MA in Spanish literature from IU, and I was also alongside that teaching Spanish, so teaching the Spanish language at different levels at IU. And I think, as I was thinking about, what to say at the panel today, I was just really thinking about those 2 degrees, the MFA and the MA, because they were so different, and I think they really pushed me to think in 2 different ways in terms of communication. I think the MFA was this way of really unleashing my imagination and really thinking associatively, letting anything, just build as I was writing. And I think the MA, it was a critical degree, right? So that was a way of deconstructing text and just breaking apart ideas, breaking apart, somebody's patterns of thought, seeing what they're focusing on, seeing what holes there are, maybe what they're skipping over, seeing what assumptions people are making and what they're saying. So I think those 2 degrees were incredibly helpful. And then one more thing that I want to say about the MFA is, and I'm not sure if how many creative writing programs specifically there are in Europe, but what we do in the United States is we have workshops. And basically, when you write a short piece, whether it's an essay or a story, you present it to your workshop, the group takes it home and they come back. And then they talk for about an hour about your piece, and you're not allowed to speak. And I think that was immensely helpful to me as a writer, because I could see what they were focusing on. I could see what they were interested in. I could really get a sense of my audience and really adjust things, accordingly. So after I received the degrees, I ended up staying at IU and working as an academic advisor for 5 years, where I was advising students one-on-one on their degrees. And I was concurrently from time to time working for the English department. So I was teaching creative writing at times. And I was also working as a freelance writer where I would write feature stories for an alumni magazine that we have out of IU. And alongside that, when I could, I was continuing my creative writing because that's really a passion project, and publishing poems and short stories and personal essays. So I did that for about 5 years, and then I applied to my position currently, which is speechwriter and communications specialist for the provost of our campus. So we have a very large campus. I think with faculty, staff, and students combined, it's somewhere close to 55,000. So our provost speaks at about 150 events a year. So my job is largely events related. So basically, researching an event, sometimes helping plan, but briefing the provost on it and drafting speeches for each event. So really understanding the audience. Sometimes I also write feature stories for the office that come out of our newsroom. And I also sometimes handle the provost's personal correspondence, so the formal correspondence to different audiences. So that is my background. And I would say that what I found is most valuable in my job is, obviously I think the writing and the editing skills, but I think people skills are critical, because so often you're in a position where you need information from others, they are the experts in the field. So really knowing how to approach people, really knowing how to listen, not really make assumptions. So that has been incredibly helpful. And I think like in hiring somebody, I would look for that primarily. And I know that's like a soft skill, we listed on resumes as a soft skill, people skills, but I would want to see somebody who's been in a lot of different situations with a lot of different people, who knows how to talk to people, who knows how to push for information, who has that initiative, because so often in my job, you come across dead ends and you really have to keep on pushing. So I'm going to wrap up there. But thank you.
That's great. And this is really fascinating to hear the different ways that people have come into this. It is as varied and surprising as we have anticipated. Doug, let's move on to you, and we're going to circle back around to these things. But I want really to hear everybody on their own background at this point. Thanks.
Well, Russell, thank you, and hello everyone. And I'm delighted to have been invited to participate in the panel, especially with my old friend Les Linkowski. It's good to see you, Les. So I am the Associate Vice President for Federal Relations for Indiana University. So I think of myself as the Chief Communicator on federal matters for IU, both communicating outwardly to federal audiences, primarily Capitol Hill and executive branch agencies, but then also communicating back to my colleagues on campus about information that I receive from members of Congress or congressional staff, or the kind of notices that are put in the Federal Register, what they mean, and how we might move forward with those. My own background is I'm an IU alum. I was a political science major with a communications minor. So I think my training actually fit very well for what I've ended up doing. I did an internship with Indiana's senior Senator Richard Lugar during my senior year at IU. And to be honest, that really opened the door to what I wanted to do, which was to come to Washington, D.C., work in the federal system. I first started on the House Appropriations Committee. I was there for 7 years. From that position, I took a job as I led the education practice for a private lobbying firm. And in 2005, I opened the IU Washington, D.C. office. My function had always been housed on campus before, but in 2005, the Board of Trustees determined that it made sense to have a dedicated presence here in D.C. to work on a daily basis with the Indiana congressional delegation and with federal executive agencies. And so I opened the office in 2005, and lo and behold, 16 years later, I'm still here. So that's my training. I want to echo some of the things that my colleagues have said. So really, I think you can train for this kind of position, but it's really the practical experience that requires sort of years and years of working in the system that prepare you to excel in a position like this. People skills are absolutely critical. You have to be able to read a room. You have to be able to know, okay, I'm preparing the president of Indiana University to make this pitch, this request to Senator Young. We go in to meet with the senator. The senator only wants to talk about X issue. There's really no room, no air in the room to put forward the request we want to make. So we have to pivot. We have to respond to the senator at that moment. We have to make sure that we provide a response that actually responds to the question or the concern that he's raised. It's absolutely critical to be able to read a room. My job is to prepare the university president or my colleagues, if I take them in to meet with Senator Young, Senator Braun, or an executive branch official, to prepare them for what is going to happen in that meeting. Here's what we're going to say, here's what they're going to say. And that requires that I meet with their staff people first to lay out, here's what we'd like to cover. What would you like us to be prepared to talk about? There could be an issue that the senator could have heard on NPR that morning driving in, some new issue with COVID and vaccination requirements. And that's really all he wants to talk about. Well, how do we maneuver that conversation to getting to the request we had planned to make? So it takes a special skill, and I see my job as sort of navigating those waters and doing it in real time, very often, trying to get back on the topic, but at the same time, being responsive to what the senator wants to talk about. Another very important quality in my job is keeping confidences. And this is, you can't teach this. This is something you have to really have an innate sense, the ability to do in addition to reading a room, but to understand when something is told to you that it is not to be broadcast, that it is for you to interpret, to then put into action based on that confidence you've been told. Another key quality is to anticipate that you may get pushback on your idea. And this goes back to being able to read the room, understanding, and I think my colleague just before said, you have to know your audience. If we're taking in a request that is going to end up, doubling a program, for instance, one of the things we're working on right now is an effort to double the Pell Grant program. That's not going to sail with some of our conservative members, some of our conservative Republican members. They are not going to buy into that. So how do we navigate that? How do we change the message, or do we put that request forward at all? Typically, we know these members, we know their staff, and we will find ways that they can help advance the Indiana University priority. It may not be the same, so we may not take a request to double the Pell Grant program into every congressional office. Some of the offices are very interested in helping our School of Medicine advance Alzheimer's disease research, and so we may focus our message there with those audiences, but it's really important to know your audience. And then Russell, you asked about what kind of qualities I would look for in a new hire. Well, we have a new hire starting in the IUDC office next Monday. And so I've recently gone through several interviews, and one of the most critical elements, qualities that I looked for was somebody who could keep confidences and somebody who could really listen and understand the question being asked and respond to that question. So let me stop there. I know we'll have a chance to weigh in with perhaps some other thoughts later.
Excellent. Thank you. That's a very helpful answer. Again, the range is amazing. The on-the-ground experience seems to be coming out as an especially important trait. And I like your little formulations of reading a room and pivoting. And I think some of those we might be able to put into a little handbook. Les, let's move on to you, and you can talk about your background as well.
Thanks very much, and good morning to everyone. I'm sorry to have joined a bit late since my computer refused to abide by the schedule and booting up. But actually, it's worked out well, because what I'm going to say builds on what has come before, but I think adds something rather different, which is really the essence of the course I developed when I was teaching at IU at the O'Neill School, that communications, to be effective, is really an aspect of strategic planning. I think it is absolutely true that all the things the previous panelists have said about writing skills, knowledge of how the media works, ability to read a room, the experience that comes with many years of working in an area, all those are necessary, but they are not sufficient. For public communicators, especially in government, it is critical that they have the ability to understand the issues, the policy issues that they are trying to communicate, and in fact participate in the discussions of shaping positions on those issues. Let me, I'll come back to that, I'm sure, as we go through the morning, but let me just tell you how I came to that. My background is very unusual, I think, compared to people on this panel and others you may have studied with. I went to Harvard in the late 1960s to earn a PhD in public policy, and especially to work with a man who is very well known in the United States as probably one of the most effective public intellectuals of the second half of the 20th century, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. After being a successful tenure at Harvard, previously he'd worked in the Kennedy administration and the Nixon administration. He went on to be elected as United States Senator from New York, where he served, I believe it was 4 terms. A columnist for the Washington Post wrote about Senator Moynihan, that he probably wrote more books than most senators ever read. That may be a bit of an exaggeration, but it does really reflect what he taught me and others, that to be a public intellectual, the intellectual part of it, which means understanding the substance of what it is you're communicating, is really critical. In fact, when I came to Indiana University, my original contract referred to me as a public intellectual, which I don't think anyone in the history of Indiana University has ever had that designation. Anyway, I left Harvard and pursued a non-traditional path. I worked for a grant-making foundation in the United States called the Smith Richardson Foundation, one of whose principal areas of interest, this was the late 70s, early 80s, was supporting human rights groups, particularly post-Helsinki Accord groups, in what was then the Soviet Union and the satellite countries. And so a lot of what we did involved figuring out how to communicate messages about human rights in closed society, and to work with those within those societies who are trying to do so. One organization we work closely with, which will be familiar to many of you, was Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe. Secondly, when I left that in 1983, and this is the job which probably most fully involved me in public communications, became Deputy Director of the United States Information Agency in the Reagan administration. It's not, that agency was abolished or merged into the State Department in the 1990s, but the mission of USIA was to use public diplomacy, or what some would call soft power, to help support American foreign policy interests. So, for example, one of the things I did was when a Korean airliner was shot down by Russian fighter planes over the Kamchatka Peninsula, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations presented the recordings of the air traffic to show that this was not an accident. And what we had to do was very quickly translate Russian into subtitles in English and other languages, so the remarks could be understood. I came to Indiana in 1990 to be the head of a research institute that was based here called the Hudson Institute. It's a think tank. And there too, while I had many fine scholars doing research on a great many public problems, my job as president of the organization was to figure out how to communicate this research effectively, not only to potential donors, but to the public at large. One of the most important things we did was a series of projects that got a great deal of attention, highlighting some of the challenges the American economy would face because the growth rate of our population was being found among people who were not doing particularly well in schools. At the same time, the economy was requiring more and more highly skilled people. I joined Indiana University as a public intellectual in 1997, I believe, working on philanthropy and nonprofit organizations. But as I mentioned, I also developed a course at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs on communications for public and nonprofit groups, and gave that for several years, assessing a variety of cases. Actually, if time permits today, I've prepared very brief summaries of 2 cases of big issues in the United States, and I think worldwide right now. I'll show you the approach I used in this course. And in both cases, there have been basically sensible policies undermined by bad communications. I also took a leave of absence, which you are allowed to do in the United States, to spend 2 years working as the chief executive officer of the Corporation for National and Community Service in the United States, which is the organization that chiefly promotes volunteering. And I'll conclude by giving you an example of how I used communications in connection with the aftermath of the attacks of September 11th. I was serving in this job as the attacks occurred. And when I came to Washington the week after 9/11, I immediately became part of a task force President Bush had prepared called to deal with the question of Homeland Security. At the time, President Bush, who was very proud of the fact that he was the first American president with an MBA degree, felt that creating a Department of Homeland Security was a dumb idea, reorganizing big chunks of the US government while we're sitting around worrying about anthrax attacks or other kinds of terrorist attacks didn't make much sense. But we didn't have any alternative. And of course, in politics, any alternative is likely to beat no alternative. Congress and the press were very much interested in creating a Department of Homeland Security. After attending one of these meetings, I had a research assistant dig up some information about what President Franklin D. Roosevelt did after the attack on Pearl Harbor to mobilize the entire American population and create what we call the Great Civic Generation. And it turned out we found a pamphlet called What You Can Do to Help, which said that, which called on all Americans either to serve in the military, to work on civilian defense, to work in defense industries, but it also made clear that in a time of trouble, everyone should do something. Help a needy neighbor, care for somebody who's sick. And President Roosevelt actually appointed his wife, the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, to head up this effort to mobilize American volunteers. I sent this over to the White House, which loved it, and it became part of President Bush's State of the Union address in 2002, the first major statement he gave after the attacks of September 11th. This speech is generally remembered as the axis of evil speech because it begins by talking about countries, Iran, Iraq, North Korea, that were regarded at the time as state sponsors of terrorism. Most people forget the way it ends, which I take very personally because I wrote that. And it ends with a call on all Americans to give at least 4,000 hours of their lives to volunteering. And the way the speechwriters wrapped the beginning to the end was by saying, in a time of evil, we must all try to do good. And as we've seen in the 20th anniversary commemorations here in the United States of 9/11, lots of people ask the question, how come there was so much civic engagement then, and so we're so divided today? There are lots of reasons. Certainly being attacked promotes unity, but this was also a deliberate policy decision communicated initially in a State of the Union address to promote civic engagement, and at least for a time it worked. So that's why I think that good communications requires an understanding of policy and the involvement of communicators in policy decisions. Thanks.
Thank you, Les. That's a great story about the Bush speech. I didn't know that. The way they framed that sounds almost like a slight revision of St. Francis of Assisi's dictum. While we have time, we should do good, as opposed to in a time of evil, we should do good. Anyway, very interesting, and thank you all for the background. I see one question in the chat here, and that's for, it looks like it might be for you, Yeva. We will get to that. First, I want to read a couple of the questions. I'm going to synthesize a little bit that we received earlier to try and be as efficient as possible. And this one, I think everybody in the group has talked about in some capacity already. But it makes it a little bit more, it narrows it down a little bit more. So it's related to what you said, Doug, about being able to read a room and being aware of your audience, pivoting those sorts of skills. The question is about communicating with different social groups, not different constituencies, not different people with different interests necessarily, but different people with different backgrounds. So it may be talking to the poor, it may be talking to a different social class, it might be talking to a group of people who are immigrants, let's say, but the extreme diversity of communication environments we find ourselves in these days seems to require some special skills here, some awareness, maybe special training. How do you think the process of helping government communicators, strategic communicators, to be effective needs to incorporate this, let's say, this aspect of talking to different social groups? And we don't have to go in any particular order, really, anybody who has a thought.
Well, I'd be glad to take a whack at that. I think it's really important. One of the things that another axiom of my course was for communicators, it's not what you say that really matters, it's what people hear. And the only way I mean, it's not the only way. We have a whole industry of public opinion polling. So that's one way, but there are lots of other ways that communicators can find out what people are hearing. And we all know that the same words may mean very different things to different groups. And I'm not even going to get into how you might segment the groups, but they can. And it is really important. I mean, well, let me give you another example from 9/11. So President Bush, early on after the attacks, started calling on the United States to embark on a crusade. That was the word he used. He quickly, though, was corrected because at the same time, President Bush had instructed everyone, and he personally had been trying to reach out to Arab Americans who were all loyal American citizens, in fact, had voted for President Bush in 2000. But the word crusade really brought back memories of what happened when crusaders went to the Middle East to try to reclaim the Holy Land. So it was a poor choice of words, but he was correct. The damage, though, was, I think, done, in that President Bush still is more remembered for the aggressiveness of his policy and less so the initial instincts to reach out and bring Arab Americans into the fold.
Anybody else interested in trying this one about social groups? I'm also thinking this is Ukraine, right? So we're talking about veterans. We're talking about people who've been hurt in the conflict in Donbass, people who might have lost their property, lost their livelihoods. They had to migrate to different parts of the country, disruptions because of the military conflict of schooling, all sorts of things.
I think that still want to say some small thing that as I had mentioned that it's very important visual communication nowadays, and I think that it's also important because in visual communication you can find a lot of things that common for all the group. For example, we already have some things which we know all. If you will see an anonymous mask, all of us say that it's related with some kind of protests. So some kind of visual things, they create some common understanding. And I think it can work in this case, and people who are working in communication must have some skills in visual communication that they can reach and poor people and immigrants in this case, and etc. I think that is the point nowadays, especially as we know, even in case of poor and immigrants people, nowadays all people are using mobile phones in all cases. So in this case, one thing is language is important, but visual communication is important too. And even we prepared a paper on mobile governments and use of social marketing in this case. So, and in our opinion, that government still is not, government always will still do not use properly mobile government as by providing different things through social marketing and trying to reach minds and hearts of their residents, citizens, and different social groups.
Yes, Eva, I see you have.
Yeah, if this is, in my view, it's extremely difficult question nowadays. So I do not have an exact answer what to do. But I will contribute to this discussion with like two considerations that we know from the studies that we do. And one, of course, is and it's axiomatic that you have to talk with your audiences in the language, not in linguistically, but in terms of semiotically, in terms of understanding, etc., etc. That's axiomatic. But the problem is nowadays that channels, how do we reach this audience, that they merge, different media channels merge, and how can you segment them? That's one issue. And on the other hand, there is an issue that there's the so-called information bubbles, that people tend to pick up the views that conform to their beliefs, and they form these closed circles with a certain opinion. And then, I mean, it's extremely difficult how you can try to persuade people within those groups. And yeah, I don't have an answer. It's very difficult. Yeah.
So I see you, Lana. I just wanted to piggyback on what you said, Eva. What you described, the information bubble. It's a what Cass Sunstein one time called it the daily me. Basically, it's the selection of media that you allow to get to you, and it's you. It's just you again. Yes, Lana, you had something to add.
Well, I mean, when you asked your question, I had, 1,000 different thoughts going through my head. But I think, if we're thinking specifically about groups who have gone through difficulties, recent difficulties, who are going through something, I think, one thing that I've learned in my position is that it's just critically important not to remain quiet. It's critically important to keep on putting communications out there. And I think these have to be communications where you are recognizing what is happening. If somebody has been wronged in some way, where you are, first of all, recognizing it, and where you are in some way showing a common vision or a common mission when it comes to that. So I guess like that is the primary thought that comes to my mind. And what the reason I'm thinking of this is because in the last year, in particular, the pandemic year, we've had all of these just horrible, just racial incidents happening around the country, and we've had stuff happening in our own town. So I think it's been always critical for the leaders to recognize that immediately, recognize how a particular group has been wronged. Yeah.
So you raise a really interesting question, Lana. I just have to ask everybody about this. Not to remain quiet, that necessity to make a statement. And I know that the provost's office, the president's office, the deans are constantly being asked to make a statement about something, right? Everybody's got their interests, and they're watching things happen around the world. And there's a famine, and there's a fire, and there's a flood, and there's a uprising, and you're asked to make a statement. How do you decide which ones to make statements about? Because if you make a statement about everything, people will stop listening. It's too much. And some things you decide to make statements about. The provost makes a few statements, right? The governor makes a few statements, but it's not everything. How does the communications staff help to make that case? This one we need to make a statement about. These others you can let go.
I think the key factor ought to be, what are you trying to accomplish? Your strategy, in other words. How does making a statement either help or not help your strategic objectives, and what kind of statement? One of the classic miscommunications where the White House felt they needed to make a statement, but it was not helpful whatsoever, and anyone could have told them this. Shortly after the United States went into Iraq, President Bush flew, supposedly, a fighter plane onto the deck of a carrier and emerged from the cockpit looking like one of the figures from a Hollywood movie, and changed into civilian clothes and stood in front of the flight deck with a banner behind him called Mission Accomplished. This was about 2003, 2004. They wanted to make a statement. They were under a lot of pressure about what was going on in Iraq, but it turned out this statement was, to put it mildly, premature. So sometimes saying nothing is better than saying something prematurely. In all cases, the key issue is, how does the statement fit with your larger set of objectives?
If I can jump in too, I completely agree with Les. I think I like to think of myself as a glass half full kind of guy, that I'm very much an optimist. But at the same time, my job is to look at, well, what is the downfall here? What is the potential fallout that could happen if we take a certain action? And so, as in Les's example, I assume somebody must have said, boy, this could go over really badly, but that message might not have reached the top, or it might have been overruled. I think it's important to weigh the pros and cons. And I don't mean to make this too much of an academic exercise, but you always have to think about, well, what is the downfall here? What if we say this? If it's not said correctly, boy, we could really put ourselves into create a problem. And sometimes it's better not to say anything than to make a statement. So I think in assessing the action, we always have to look at, well, what is the potential fallout here if we do this incorrectly?
Any other thoughts on this? Okay, so another question from people who wrote in has to do with the recent changes in communication based on technology. We talked about it a little bit. There's a lot more noise, and then there's also a certain degree of misinformation, and it raises all sorts of challenges. They're different from the ones that we had before these various new communication platforms were available. So there are a variety of questions we can ask here. What have the skills needed changed in regard to this new environment? And if so, how? What do we need to teach people in order to deal with these various kinds of challenges? And then I think there's an underlying one as well. In particular, when there is misinformation, how do you go about correcting that? Is silence possible for some cases? And sometimes when you correct something and it's too emphatic, it just looks like you're backpedaling, or you're just sticking to your talking points, and so people can often see through those sorts of things. How do you deal with those the new challenges, in particular the ones that I just laid out with regard to communications in a digital age?
Okay.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Just briefly, I mean, when you so two questions about technologies, and I would refer to what Yaroslav all the time is speaking about visual. I would say multimedia skills is of extreme importance, so that you can make videos, post, and use those different mediums. So I think that will be my short answer to the first question. But when it comes to misinformation, then again, we should, I mean, definitions, disinformation, misinformation, whatever. I will speak from the perspective of Latvia, because we experience a lot of Kremlin disinformation campaigns. And I guess in the US, you have the same issues these days. And then indeed there is a question what to do with it, to counter it, or do some different ways how to mitigate those attacks. And what I can share from the studies that we have done, that some, I mean, when to speak about Kremlin's information campaigns, which includes lots of disinformation. So in my view, the larger problem is long-term communication and construction of the worldview, that's one part of the problem. And then there is a part of problem, some smaller disinformation campaigns. And what our studies of social reactions shows that that some particular disinformation campaigns perhaps are not so visible to large part of society. And so if you take every bit of piece of disinformation and try to react to them, what you may achieve rather is that you pay attention to this disinformation. And so maybe this sometimes it's really better to ignore, because our studies shows that some specific disinformation campaigns do not reach large audiences. So maybe it's better to leave. But what is important, actually, my main point, what I want to say, is to formulate your own values, your own ideas, and promote these. That's what I would like to say.
I could just add to that two things. First of all, yes, you need people who do understand social media and how it works. I never have had a Twitter account. I couldn't even get on Twitter, and that, of course, is one of the older versions of social media. But it's important to remember that with social media, we are going from broadcasting to what is called narrowcasting. Social media gives you a great opportunity to reach out directly to those people you believe are going to be most receptive to your message or to your response to misinformation. We have seen this. Donald Trump really practiced this very well. So did President Obama and many others, using social media not to reach widely, but to really focus on the people most likely to be receptive to your messages. Secondly, with regard to misinformation, I don't think things have much changed since, about 150 years ago. The writer Mark Twain supposedly said, by time the truth gets its boots on, the lie has traveled around the world many times. Lies have that ability. You have to respond to that, to at least some of them. When I was working in the Reagan administration, we had a major effort to deal with disinformation from the Soviet Union. And one thing we did, we're particularly concerned about, were stories being spread in Africa that the CIA had developed HIV/AIDS. We would get these reports from our consular officials in African countries, and we'd immediately try to send out messages through the tools we had, like the Voice of America, to counter that. Well, I don't know how much good it did. I don't want to say amused, because it's always sad, but of course, with the COVID pandemic, you will still see efforts to suggest, usually coming from China, that COVID-19, the coronavirus, was manufactured in a CIA or US military laboratory. And of course, on our side, we're having a big debate over what the Chinese did. So this is the nature of the world.
Lana, you had something.
Well, I was just thinking about social media and how we handle social media. And I think Leslie was talking about how you use it to reach your audiences, and that is true. But I think, your posts spread like wildfire these days, and anything can go, viral, and it's going to reach much further than your intended audience. And I think our approach is to remain engaged with those who follow us on social media, to respond to them. And we do want that channel of communication. Unless somebody, I think, is making a very negative statement, being insulting, we tend to stay away from that unless the volume of that about a particular incident, increases to such an extent where it has to be addressed. And then we may use both social media and other means to address that. But it is a question of volume.
Yeah, and I've watched you do that in the provost's office. It's quite skillful. I mean, sometimes the graffiti, nobody notices it, and sometimes the graffiti gets a lot of news, and the one that gets the news needs to be commented on. Yaroslav, you had your hand up.
Still want to continue that also Yeva mentioned it, that multimedia skills, and I think that it's also related with visualization or multimedia, let's say. And what I actually missed from my government, where I am living, I can't say about all government, but I think also in many European countries, I think maybe in USA, the situation is different, especially during the quarantine. And what I miss is that the government actually did not try to use any some kind of caricatures, some kind of jokes, some kind of memes. And I actually thought that maybe they can do something that, especially at that difficult times, some kind of pictures, funny pictures, that people can a little bit to relax. Because now we have, especially in societies, huge protests and people are very angry. And I think that this is one of the problems that still continue through this quarantines, that nobody tried to make any jokes inside of communication field. So all aware focused on how to be very serious, how to fight this pandemic. But I think in this difficult time, we must each time to look for funny pictures, not only from different people, but from government too. And you can also hire different specialists, especially I think they were free at that time, especially people who are making different caricatures or some kind of pictures, and they probably create some funny pictures, and people will be not so angry at nowadays, because it was a lot of things are focused on just how to fight this pandemic, how to communicate efficiently different rules, but nobody think about how to make a less nervous society. And now the outcomes, we have that a lot of protests, people unhappy with different opportunity paths, with still a lot of people anti-vaccinated. So I think this is important to have some healthy part of jokes, funny pictures, caricatures in government communication. And you can also criticize in some kind itself if you are doing something wrong. I think so.
It's very interesting. In our meetings with the ministry personnel, nobody brought up being able to tell jokes as a skill, but they did often bring up sort of what you were talking about before, Yaroslav, with regard to visual storytelling, and I suppose storytelling in general. That as a skill, being able to construct a narrative using images and words was something that they thought would be especially valuable. And that brings me to yes, go ahead, Les.
May I just jump in on this, because I have a great story from the Cold War that might be of particular interest to the class. One of the duties I had at U.S. Information Agency was being on the receiving end of a joke collection effort. President Reagan, remember, career in Hollywood, believed that effective use of humor often really hit at some of the issues that he was trying to address better than more policy oriented activities. So we had a foreign service officer, I believe he was stationed in Germany, if I remember correctly, whose job it was, this would have been about 83, to collect jokes from inside the Soviet Union and satellites. They didn't go directly to the White House, because if that ever got out, it would have been a scandal. They came to me. I was kind of the cutout. And my job was to get them to the contact at the National Security Council. And yes, President Reagan, you can go back over his speeches, would work these jokes into his speeches. There's actually now, I can say this publicly, because there's now been a book written about this project. It's got a great title, and I'd be glad to send the citation. I think it's probably only in English. It's called Hammer and Tickle. And it describes this effort, but it was understood. I can't say that other presidents have understood this as well, but Reagan, with his theatrical background, had a good sense of this.
It's a terrible title for a book. I imagine if they were collecting those jokes in Germany during the Cold War, and especially jokes that came out of the Soviet Union and satellite countries, many of those arose in the Gulag among political prisoners. A lot of the jokes in the Soviet Union, that's where they were born. Anyway, I was going to just finish the context for that next question, which it has to do with storytelling and the fact that when we got this grant from the U.S. Embassy, from the political affairs section, we went there. It was actually Andriy Mileshevich and I. We went to the embassy and talked with the public affairs folks. And he made it clear to us, they couldn't say this when they put out the RFP, but they made it clear to us that the reason they were doing this, one of the main reasons they were doing this, was that around the world, Russia was telling Ukraine's story. And it was just very clear. Ukrainians needed to learn how to tell their own story and do it effectively. And they didn't have personnel who were ready to do that. They didn't have a lot of personnel. They had some, but they didn't have a lot, and they needed to beef up their storytelling skills. That he didn't quite put it that way, but he did put it in terms of telling a story, telling a national story, telling an international story that included Ukraine in it. And so the storytelling skills came up many times as we were talking with our colleagues at Kiev Mohyla and with the folks in the ministries about how to train people who would have certain kinds of skills. Andriy always struggled with the other part of this, and this came up in your comments just a minute ago, Yeva, because long-term, you can teach people how to tell stories. You can teach them how to be effective with images. It's not going to guarantee that their values are in the right place. Andriy would often segue when we'd be talking about this. Okay, but how do we guarantee that we're not just teaching people how to manipulate public opinion? How do you give a kind of democratic core to the program? And he taught a course on sort of the history of democratic values, but besides teaching a course, how do you maintain in your communications practice, your practice in the daily level, a kind of ethical base and encourage these sort of values to be permeating your institution? Because you're sort of just the person who's interpreting. On one hand, you're the translator, but you're also fundamentally involved in the process, right? You're in there. They're your words too. You're giving voice to these things. So the communications professionals are in a key position to do this and help to maintain those values. So it's a kind of a tricky question. I am curious whether you have thoughts about this, how to do it in a training regime, let's say, on one hand, but also in your personal practice, whether you think about this as you're doing your daily job, and then how it might express itself, manifest itself in your work.
I guess like as you're asking that question, I'm thinking about when I used to teach creative writing. We talk about the craft of writing, the different elements, right, in fiction, and then we talk about the art, right? And I think the craft, you can train someone. You can train someone to really put together a story that's very tight and that has a lot of great images, right? Concrete images that doesn't speak in abstractions. But then there's this art aspect, the spirit under it, which is a little bit deeper, and it's vague, right? But I think if I put my creative writing aside and I think about my job for the provost, I think in terms of speeches, in terms of the speeches that the provost gives, what helps immensely is really listening to the people who know, right? Interviewing them, seeing what the nuances of the situation are, not assuming anything and not being afraid to ask stupid questions, and seeing how the people who are in the know when it comes to this particular audience, how they can tell you how the audience is really constructing their world and what is important to them, and you can then tell their story and reflect them back to themselves, right? And I think for the feature pieces that I write for the news, it's very similar. I'll typically interview people one-on-one, and I can come with my set of prepared questions, but oftentimes, I don't know enough to ask the right questions, right? So as the conversation is going, you start to feel your way through it and understand what is truly important to this person. What are the deeper values and the deeper vision behind this. So I would say, listening is just very, very critical to what I would call the art of the job, right? To the storytelling and to really relating somebody else's story as faithfully as possible.
Yes, Yeva, please.
Yeah, if I may go on. Honestly, I have been thinking about those issues that you brought up, Russell, especially if we look from the perspective of how strategic communication is being used by democratic countries and authoritarian countries like Russia and China. And the problem is that Russia, China, and probably other authoritarian countries, actually, they are learning from the West to a large extent, from the knowledge that we have about mass communication. And then it really, when it comes to methods, like what they do, especially Russia, I have been more focused on what Russia is doing. They largely imitate the tools and that has been used by the West. And so indeed, so how do we differentiate it? And my answer to this is that values is what makes a difference. Not methods, not techniques, but values and the purpose. If you're, and I think this is really important. If you do it with the purpose to promote and to defend fundamental freedoms, human rights, etc., it makes a difference. It makes a difference if you use it for promoting the interests and of authoritarian regime. I think that's one aspect that I want to bring up. But when it comes to storytelling, and I agree that it's absolutely important skill, but I would like to add, because what I do in my everyday life, I do the opposite. We analyze narratives, which is also important to analyze narratives, themes, and messages, how your opponent constructs and what is strategic goals behind those narratives. So this is also an important skill in my view.
I want to take the Machiavellian position on this panel and argue that truthful communications are not always effective communications. There are many examples of this. One of the books I used to use when I taught was a classic study called A Bodyguard of Lies about deception efforts by Britain and other allied countries during the Second World War. The authors Winston Churchill once said, for truth to be effective, it must sometimes be accompanied by a bodyguard of lies. Even more recently, we've seen examples of this. So Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is probably the most influential person in the United States response to COVID, admitted a while ago that he set various figures for the proportion of the population that needed to be vaccinated in order to try to encourage people to be vaccinated. This was a while ago. We've known about this ever since Plato, who wrote, of course, about the noble lie, the lie that a public official sometimes has to tell a philosopher king in order to get people to act in the right way, right, and I agree with what was just said, right being seen from the perspective of the values of the speaker, but of course they may not be everyone's values. Now, you know, in terms of what you need to do, I think there are two things. First of all, I think people who work in communications always have to be attuned to the potential that what they are receiving is a miscommunication designed to deceive. I had a friend many years ago who felt that every finding of an intelligence agency ought to be presented to a special panel of magicians, con men, and functional paranoids who were accustomed to seeing in a particular communication strange things or looking at it from a very different perspective. So you really need to develop the ability to be skeptical of communications, even when they come from otherwise authoritative and credible sources. And secondly, when you're thinking of doing it oneself to advance one's own objectives, again, one has to ask, will it really advance the objectives? What's the possibility of backfiring on you, that the act, it'll be seen to be false, and then discredit the larger set of truths you're trying to advance. We had to deal with this once in Afghanistan during the 80s. We had the ability technically to have video coming live from the battlefields in Afghanistan. We wanted to show the tragedy of the Soviet occupation in Afghanistan at the time. But to do it effectively, it had to be sent up through an intelligence satellite and then bounced over to a commercial satellite for downlinking to an American broadcaster. Problem with that is it could be exposed. Even though it was real video, we did not want this to be seen as something the intelligence agencies were doing, but we really had no choice given the nature of the signal. So we decided not to do it.
So this is it does sound like a different approach. Yeva, your comments about values seem to highlight them and foreground them, whereas what you were just talking about, less is more they're in the background, and we're thinking about strategy primarily and effectiveness, and that it's not necessarily that we reconcile these two views, but I can see that there is a difference in approach, and I wonder if anybody else has anything else to add about. My initial question really is about how and whether you keep those values foregrounded in your own thinking as you're doing your work, or maybe are you just approaching it the way Les is talking about and trying to be effective and efficient and strategic in your thinking? I know it's a hard question. I can tell you in my daily work, I probably don't try to put values out there all the time. But when I'm a good teacher, I think I'm doing that. I think I'm asking, what do I want? It's a strategic question. What do I want the students to get from this? So it's very directed, but the values are usually what I want them to get. So I'm really focused on trying to convey those values. Let's circle back up to this question by Valentina Kuzik, since it brings up a question that is likely to branch into other questions, and we haven't really talked about the pandemic too much, except for from a humorous standpoint, as Yaroslav suggested. So the question is directed towards you, Yeva. She says, you've mentioned a study you were involved in on the efficacy of government communications regarding COVID. What were your main findings? Was it a global or a locally focused study? And she says, thank you in advance. And then you feel free to answer that in however you want. And then obviously we can talk a little bit more about communications regarding COVID because it's a big topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Valentina, for your question. Yeah, and indeed, it was a locally oriented study because it was part of a huge research project, because our government really wanted to have a scientific approach, and they invested resources in involving scientists to find better ways out of COVID crisis. And our small group with two of my colleagues, we particularly focused on the effectiveness of government communications. And our approach was on the process. What we did, we tend to understand from the perspective of government communication professionals, the people who are involved in this process. How do they see it? What was difficult? What was challenges? What worked well for them? And albeit our focus was very locally oriented, I think our findings very much resonate to what we are discussing all over during this panel. And I will highlight 4 aspects that are important in my view. And one of the most important conclusions was that government communications overall, and specifically in times of crisis, they should be a strategic management function. And again, I think it is axiomatic, especially for strategic communications. But what we saw in the case of Latvian government, that it was used as largely as support function. And also there are some other studies done by our students, which also validates what we found. Because what we mean by management function, by that we meant in practical terms that those who are responsible for communications, they are part of a decision-making team along with other specialists. But what we experienced from what was said to us by professionals, that they rather listened to what is decided and then thought how to communicate. But in our view, government communication experts must give feedback. They should know society's perceptions and attitudes very well, and to provide that competence in the decision-making circle. And this was not the case. The second issue is in such large-scale crisis, what we identified was that in order to overcome this crisis, you need to involve non-governmental organizations, commercial organizations. They should be part of the solution of the problem. And we've found out that this link between government and the rest of society was not as established as it should be. So this is the second issue. The third issue, to some extent it is naive, of course, because obviously different politicians and political forces also try to use crisis for their own purpose. Nevertheless, I think in such a large-scale crisis, there is, I would use a sort of normative approach that you must, as a politician, think about common good, and it's not the case, of course, obviously, and this is what makes problematic government communication. But again, I admit it is naive, but still, nevertheless, I think it is a matter also of talking to politicians and explaining them the importance of this aspect. And finally, what I would like to stress is that it is, and this was already mentioned in this panel, but I think it is so important that it needs to be stressed again and again, that you should know your target audience. And I will end up with just one practical quote from our expert that who told us this decision-making process among politicians, that they thought that people do not want to have restrictive measures. That was their assumption, and they wanted to make regulations more loosely. But when they announced, also, when we did some quantitative studies, we found out that actually people were concerned, large part of society was concerned about health issues, and they actually supported more restrictive measures. So without having those data, it's very easy to end up in a wrong decisions. So I think four aspects general, which might be also applied, I believe, to other contexts as well. So I will stop here, and maybe others will have something.
That's very helpful. It also reminds me of the repeated message we got from ministers and their staff in Ukraine when we did the needs assessment regarding crisis communications, and the need to have people who were skilled at crisis management, also stress management. They mentioned that explicitly, stress management in a communications role. And then your other point about being involved in the decision-making process, not just being at the tail end. Not all the ministries talked about that, but some of the more enlightened ones did, I would say. And there was one in particular who was the acting minister of health at the time. I think she was actually an American, Ukrainian-born American, American-born Ukrainian. I think, who Suprun, her name was Suprun, who had a very, very dynamic staff around her, and she spoke a lot about this, getting them involved in the decision-making process. But it does make me wonder, and this is more of a question for you, Doug, to what extent that actually happens in a role like yours, between government and the university. Are you just the spokesperson? Are you the person who is called in at the moment where you need to facilitate the meeting, or are you actually being consulted in the process and taking part in the process of making decisions?
Russell, so no, I am very much being consulted in the process, and frankly help drive the priorities for the university, a lot of times really based on the direction that the federal government is going. Right now in Congress, Congress is working on budget reconciliation, trying to enact $3.5 trillion of new spending. Indiana University is following what is going on Capitol Hill. We're identifying the priorities that have been set by various members and trying to determine, to the extent possible, how those priorities would dovetail with our priorities. But it's not our role now to introduce new topics. We're trying to follow what has been introduced, and where there is synergy with the priorities in Congress with our priorities, we're trying to help advance that message. So I'm very much involved in the decision making, but everybody needs to be mindful. We don't set the agenda. We try to make sure that where Congress goes, that it also lines up with our priorities. But very often we're following the Congress and the administration.
Go ahead, Les.
Just wanted to pick up on the second point that Yeva just made about the role of private and community groups. At our sister institution, the University of Michigan, there is an archive that studies and collects information on the 1918 flu pandemic. It's really very interesting to read the newspapers about it and so on. And I spoke to one of the historians there who said that one of the big differences between 1918 and now is that there is a much greater sense of civic responsibility in 1918 than we see today. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, we were coming to the end of World War I, everybody had been mobilized and so on. And there's probably some truth to this, though it's also worth remembering World War I was pretty divisive as well. I think a more important factor was that the period from about 1880, certainly well into 1920 in the United States, and I think elsewhere, was marked by the creation of all sorts of community groups, many of which still exist today. The Rotary, Kiwanis, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, you can go on and on. Being a member of the American Red Cross, including the junior chapter for school children, was almost seen as obligatory at the time. And I think that that played a role in the response as well. Now, fast forward to today, and for the last 30 or 40 years ago, certainly in the US, and I have visited Ukraine as well, and I think it's true there as well, there is concern that people aren't joining groups, that community life is not as strong as it once was or should be. And I think that has affected the response to COVID. President Biden, at one point, I think, had created shortly after he came into office a network of about 250 voluntary groups to help promote vaccination. And it certainly seems to have had some effect, but obviously not enough, and we don't hear much about that anymore. So the question is whether our ability to respond to COVID and maybe other kinds of disasters reflects the greater individualism, the diminished interest in community organizations that marks certainly societies like the United States, and I think to some degree as well, but maybe for other reasons, Ukraine.
Anybody else want to chime in here about either crisis communication or specific communications challenges of COVID times? I think another factor, Les, that you didn't mention was the immigrant groups who almost invariably started their own local newspaper, usually. And, so if you go to Chicago or someplace like that, there was this local Slovene community. They had their own Slovene newspaper and created a lot of social coherence. And there were many of them. Okay, well, we are 15 minutes from the end of our allotted time, and I want to make sure and make available any additional questions that make it to anybody from the audience who might want to ask additional questions. So please raise your hand if you would like to do that. In the meantime, I promised one more question to ask one more question that came in. It really is about the specifics of the work of communication professionals, and it's a very general question, but it's about specific things like internal aspects of communication, how the process works from the task that gets allocated or the decision-making process to communicate something to the final publication or news. And I imagine some of you who've been involved with something like that at some point. So if you call to mind an example, a key, let's say, campaign or a key message that needed to get out, and just describe that process so that our listeners can get a feel for it.
Oh,
I see.
Go
Oh,
ahead.
you got your hand up? Please.
okay. Yeah, I can start, and it actually relates to COVID. So as you can imagine, for the last 18 months, there's really been almost nothing else on the agenda except the response to the pandemic. And so for Indiana University, as other universities as well, our costs, the expenses related to COVID have been staggering, from daily testing from of our students, from having to provide safe dormitories, from having to eat the costs of dining hall contracts and rooming contracts in 2020, from having to not being able to accept students in person. I mean, the costs have been staggering. And so how do we communicate that need to the federal government and still make sure what we're seeking actually makes sense? And so where we try to focus our efforts or in the cost to making the campus safe for our students and employees. And so really focusing our needs on the cost for testing and the other costs to allow safe distancing, to allow students rather than two to a dorm, to live one to a dorm if they chose, and the costs related to that, and to put those needs forward. So as the federal government was assessing where financial support would be provided, we tried to make the argument that these costs are necessary in order to ensure that our students, our employees are safe. And so that was how we really messaged, if you will, our COVID recovery. There seemed to be sympathy in Congress and with both administrations, the previous administration that signed 2 COVID recovery bills into law, and then the current administration, which signed the 3rd recovery bill into law. We wanted to be very clear, very focused on again, trying to seek financial reimbursement and support for efforts we undertook to make our campus safe.
Go ahead, Yaroslav. That's fine.
I still want to continue a little bit with skills for communication specialists. Professor Lenkowski today mentioned that communicators must be inside of decision making, and what I want to state that communicators also must be inside of the science and to also effectively communicate with scientists or researchers. And in this case, I think it will be good for both, and maybe it help also for scientists to communicate because we know that it maybe good communication specialists can help or assist to scientists or to government in cases of find some interesting paradoxes which can help communicate effectively. For example, I give an example of one Sweden scholar and his very interesting presentation that became very famous on Google. You can after that try to Google and find a lot of information. One of the idea, it was related with climate change, and this Sweden scholar mentioned that eating of human meat tackle climate change. So in this case, it's immediately becomes very famous and started communicated immediately by different media sources. So I think communication specialists must to look for such kind of different paradoxes that can also start to think, all of us to think outside of the box. So here's my point. Thank you.
Thank you. Les, you had something to add?
Yeah, I've been thinking about a couple of cases in anticipation this morning, one of which we've talked about COVID, but the other we haven't, which is the recent withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan. Leave aside questions of the policy, whether you think troops should have stayed or not. That's not what I'm getting at. once the decision had been made, and certainly this was as close to a bipartisan decision as many things we've seen lately, both parties agreed it was time to end American troops in Afghanistan. The question is, how do you effectively communicate it? And here, I think President Biden is saying these days, and I think he's correct in this, that the airlift was a great success. When you think about it, getting 100,000 people or so, and there'll be more to come, out of a city that had been taken over by the Taliban in a very short period of time, was a success from a policy point of view. But while some will agree with him on this, it's apparent from polls already that lots of people, not only Republicans, but independents, feel a mess was made. And I think a lot of this could be laid at the grounds of poor communication. Just a few examples came out of the president or the Secretary of State, that you won't be seeing another Saigon airlift here, where helicopters would be pulling people off the roof of the embassy. Well, it immediately set up a visual image of what an evacuation looks like. And sure enough, we didn't see them on the roof, but we saw the helicopters flying past the embassy. There was chaos at the airport. Why? Well, in Kabul, there weren't too many places you could go as media other than the airport. And there were lots of people trying to get out. And so the whole picture was one of chaos. There were multiple avenues, channels, social media, broadcast media. There were also a variety of groups trying to get in to evacuate people. So these messages of confusion and difficulty were coming out from a variety of sources. In effect, the White House really didn't control the communications. It was coming out from all sorts of places. My own view, there was a decision made. There was a US Air Force base about 50 miles from Kabul called Bagram, which the decision apparently, and we obviously don't know all the facts yet, was made to abandon that and instead concentrate the effort at evacuation in Kabul. And I'm sure that made sense from a military or logistic point of view, but it didn't make much sense from a communications point of view, because if they'd actually staged the evacuation out of Bagram Air Force Base, it would have been 50 miles outside of Kabul, presumably with a perimeter around it that they've been able to keep people at a distance, and the evacuation would have gone on without as much of a communications mess. So we don't know all the facts here. We don't know what role communications people played in thinking about the airlift. But this is an example, in my view, of a successful policy operation under the circumstances, becoming a disastrous one as a result of communications.
Lana or Yeva, would you like to talk about a case before we end up?
Well, like if you're thinking about campaigns, I was just thinking about a campaign that we had over the course of the pandemic for our students, and it was about masking, it was about social distancing, all of these things. But for that, we created a communications plan, with the backgrounds, the rationale, thinking about who our primary and secondary audiences are. And then we went out and gathered assets. We gathered video, we gathered photographs of mass students, and it was a social media campaign. But I was also, I guess, thinking about communications in terms of, over the course of the pandemic with our faculty and our staff and crisis communication. And I think what happened at the beginning, obviously, at the beginning of the pandemic, was that obviously everyone was feeling incredibly groundless, not just because of the fear of the virus itself, but I think people were afraid of losing their jobs. Nobody knew what was going to happen. And I think I think what was key was that we had leaders who were committed to consistently communicating and making things as transparent as possible. And it was through a variety of methods. It was through webinars, it was through written messages. And I think what I also really appreciated about that was that it was giving people a sense that there was a human, in leadership. There was a human being recognizing what they were going through. So that's what, that's what comes to mind in terms of the pandemic and also in terms of a recent campaign.
I will just briefly, obviously, as I am in academia, I do not do campaigns, but we need to communicate science as well, as Yaroslav mentioned earlier. And my experience is that from what we did, that that your work should respond to the needs of your target audience. I mean, if you do a study that is of value to larger audiences, then communication happens by itself. So then product sells by itself. So this is one of the lessons that I have learned as a scientist. Yeah, that if you do studies that are of interest for politicians and media, switch off, and then your communication goes even without an effort. You just need to find the right narrative for it, and that's it. Yeah, so that's briefly from myself.
Thank you. I realize we didn't get to all the questions that came in. There were a couple more, and one topic that we just didn't touch on at all is how do you measure success? So you're communicating. We did talk a little bit about what people hear, but how do you measure that? How do you know that you've been successful? And I guess you just sort of said sometimes you can tell that you've been successful before. Without doing very much. And so we will leave that topic for, I hope next week somebody can talk about it a little bit on next week's panel. For now, let me just say thank you again to the four of you, Lana and Yaroslav, Doug, Yeva, and Les, for contributing and being very willing to share your time with us and your expertise. I think we learned a lot, and I think that our audience is very happy that you were able to be with us, and those who couldn't are going to be able to watch the recording, and they'll learn as well. So thank you again. Thank you to the people in the background. I know you were helping with the technical. Mackenzie, thank you very much for making it run. Otherwise, nothing would happen. Everybody be well. And sorry to keep you so long, those of you in Europe. I realize you missed your dinner hour, so I hope you can now go and have a nice dinner. All right, thank you and take care.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.